That's what happened to my book.
That's what happened to your book, yeah. Somebody's trying to make a mint off of it.
Oh, funny. Funny.
But I am curious about who that is. I want to open the book and see who I wrote it to, because I assume it must be assigned.
A copy.
Right? Copy. So I'm like, who's selling this for $800?
Girl, my copy had so many yellow highlights and pencil marks in it. Because once you start writing in it, it's not a collector's item anymore. Mine is all marked up. That's what made me, it was real neat to reread the book. Em and I were just kind of rereading to keep up. So we reread chapter 1 today. And you know, Sojourner Truth and her journey to that collective that she was in
Northampton.
Yeah, just to refresh my memory. But you know, it was.
Yeah, no, I mean, the honest truth is I'm rereading it too.
Jessica?
Yes, sir.
You were a child. Did you have any academics in your family?
When I was a child, did I what?
Tell me something about your childhood, because girl, you got scholarship at a whole nother level.
Take your man.
You got scholarship at a whole nother level.
I was a bookworm and a nerd.
Well, what inspired that?
I was a bookworm and a nerd.
Yeah.
I was a bookworm and a nerd. I wanted to be a poet. So I wrote poetry and I read books all the time. In fact, my mother used to beg me to go outside and play and stop reading.
Well, you know, ain't nobody argue with your scholarship. I would tell you that right now.
Em was just saying, were there other intellectuals in your family?
Yes.
Yes.
I actually come from 4 or 5 generations of college grads.
Oh, wow.
That's a clear example of epigenetic.
Both my parents are university professors. Both my parents are university professors. My grandfather was a doctor, as was my mother. My grandmother was a music and English teacher. My father's a university professor. My mother's a pediatrician and a university professor. So, yeah, we used to have lots of conversations.
Well, you clearly
at
got
home.
that blood, that's for sure.
Being a pediatrician.
You know, this one here is the scholar in our community.
Just love to read.
And you know, when she's reading, you know, her vision's bad, so I have to, she has to read out loud, and sometimes we go over 4 or 5 sentences over and over again until we get all the details.
All right, and M, does she still underline with pencil if it's important, underline with pen if it's really important, and then double underline with pen if it's really important to put a star?
Nothing is
right about, a star or an arrow in the margin. That's the next thing you do.
So
that's too much for me now.
So when we were going, no, because she's very meticulous about this. So when we were growing up, I remember my father used to say, Paulette, I'm tired of you writing in my books. And so he would buy a book. He would buy her a separate book. He was like, Paulette, don't write in my books. You know, I don't like people writing in my book. So you had 2 of everything because my father, and you knew whose book, because my mother would dog ear. She would take notes in her beautiful handwriting, which would take notes in the margin. Oh yeah. It's funny, Mom. I don't write in books. It's funny. I will, now I take a picture of an important page. I might dog ear it, but I think I'm more like my father in that sense. Like, I don't know. It's just, I feel like if I highlight or write in a book, I don't know. But
See, that's the nice thing about the technological age that we find ourselves in now, because with books and stuff like that, even with Collective Courage, I've been reading it via PDF on my computer. And the reader that I have just allows me to highlight it and make notes and, you know, type out some notes as I'm going along. So I think that really streamlines the process and also makes sure I don't ruin my books that I actually have sitting on the shelf. Right.
Old people like the feel of books. Turn the page. Go back and look at it again.
Yeah. Well,
and you can't get distracted by the other things.
Well, you know what's nice, because I'm reading it on the Kindle. And, you know, with Kindle, if enough people like highlight a passage, then it actually kind of underlines it in the Kindle so you can see what other people think is important.
We're highlighting, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Wow,
yeah, that's interesting.
Intelligence component, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little scary, but it's also helpful.
You know it's tracking it. It's tracking what you think is important.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
do we want to give it a little bit?
Should we
Or-
give it one more minute?
I say
How are we doing? 14.
we're
It's
streaming now, but
6:04.
How many online?
14.
Are you guys hearing me okay?
Oh, yeah, loud and clear.
sound great.
Okay.
Yeah, we can wait maybe another minute or two for
Okay, good.
There's some
Because
people to
I'm
come
getting
through.
some messages that my internet isn't very strong. Yeah.
I mean, you sound good at the very
Okay.
least. If things do start going a little bit
Okay.
weird, you can always disconnect
right.
your video. But outside of that, I think we're all good.
Did everybody have a good?
I can hang up and come back, or I'll call in by phone or something. But hopefully it'll work.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, you're fine as it is right now.
Oh my goodness, is that a professional microphone?
What? Mine?
Yes.
It's just like a blue Yeti. I hope it sounds good. I got it for streaming, so I hope it
Oh
sounds
oh my goodness.
Intern showing
Oh,
out.
he's showing off.
I know. I was like, what are you, a professional voiceover artist or something?
Somebody said I did podcasts last time. I was like, you know what? I really
Yeah.
should start doing podcasts.
Hey, Deidre, we told him he was gonna be doing this program today, so he ramped up his look.
I see. You know, I think when he volunteered 2 weeks ago, he was like, I'm gonna make sure I'm on point.
He's
I'm gonna make sure that
ready.
that they know I'm serious. The rest of us got our little headphones, but
No, I'm coming with all the material.
I
I got the
you know what?
headphones in, I got the professional microphone.
I am not mad at you.
Hey, I just want to say I'm back here too. I'm back here in the trenches, the opposite of J-Roo.
And you're an IT person, Trey. You should have all the accoutrement, all the IT accoutrement.
Hey,
Others
Trey.
are here.
Good luck to everybody, though.
Hey, Trey. I was talking to your sister yesterday.
Oh, really? Yeah, she lives not too far from me. Not too far.
How's Houston?
She's pretty good. She's doing good.
No, how's Houston?
Oh, it's good. It's good. It's fairly odd. It's not too bad though. It's pretty good.
Yeah,
Very
because y'all
busy.
hanging out like y'all don't have a pandemic. That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
There's no pandemic here.
Excuse me, family business. Family business. This is
Remember,
business
we're
over
being
here.
I guess there's no pandemic here. I guess I don't know, but I mean, I take it seriously still.
It's okay to record it because I'm sure this
We're
administration
being
would love
recorded,
it.
yes, remember.
Yes, I take it very seriously, so I'm not talking down.
Yeah, right.
Let's say,
No,
as far
when
as the
I-
camera is concerned, I am.
No, when I called, she was like, "Oh, I'm having brunch with friends." I'm like, "You do that down in Texas? People do that down in Texas, not virtual, like actual." She's like, "Oh yeah, I'm having brunch. I'll call you back." I'm like, "What?"
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I'm like, "You all are the problem."
Yeah, she took it to another level. She took it
Cousins, first cousins. This is public, please. Call each other.
We're starting the campaign for
Come on, guys.
online brunches starting
Yeah,
now.
come on now, guys.
Okay.
No,
All right.
it just gave me a sense of what it's like in Texas, like that y'all roll like that, even in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm like, now I know why.
Yeah, it even shocked me. It even shocked me being gone. I came back to this. I was like, oh, okay.
People just, yeah. Anyway,
Okay.
let me mute myself.
Oh, don't even worry about it. I was honestly waiting for a few more people to show up, and it seems like a couple more people did. So I think we're ready to get started. Dr. Gordon Nembhard, are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Excellent, excellent. Well, then let me introduce myself first and foremost. I am J-Roo Kadar, newest recruit to Kepler Institute. Very happy to be here. I'm going to be your host / moderator / guy who will be sitting here in the back, making sure everything's okay alongside Trey. I'm a senior at IUPUI studying civic leadership and nonprofit management. Very happy to be here with the Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, political economist specializing in community economics, Black political economy, and popular economic literacy. Her research and publications explore problematic and alternative solutions in cooperative economic development, worker ownership, wealth inequality, and community-based approaches to justice. Her book, Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, which is the book that we are currently studying through right now, takes an in-depth look into the cooperative economic mindset of African American people across the history of America. It's honestly a great read. So far, a mother of 2 and a grandmother of 3. Proud to welcome Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard for week number 2 of the book study.
Perfect, great, thank you so much. I actually decided to try a PowerPoint this time. So when we get toward the end, or maybe even in the middle, you all can tell me whether you like it or don't like it. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let's see if I can make it into, forgot to put the, yeah, there we go, slideshow. Okay, come on, slideshow. There we go. Okay, so there's the book, though it looks like a lot of you are actually reading it online, so you don't see it. And actually, Miss Paulette already showed you it. But anyway, I thought we'd show the book again this time. And I sometimes say that it's really just about survival, resistance, and prosperity, you know, or collective survival, resistance, and prosperity. But as you know, and we're going to find out, is a lot more involved. I also remembered that we didn't totally finish our definition of cooperative, so I thought I'd just lead you a little bit through that. And then I think after I do that, I'm going to have, remember, 2 people promised to give us their reflections. I was going to have us do that, and then I was going to walk you through the stuff I want to talk about in chapter 1, and then we'll open it up to more questions. But I'm also, as usual, with limits, I'm happy to entertain comments and questions as I go along, as I said, with limits. So in case people aren't clear what we're talking about, and actually the whole book is not totally about cooperatives, right? Some of it's about mutual aid and collectives, but I did want to give the general definition of a cooperative. So owned, they're member-owned, member-run, and member-serving businesses, right? Businesses or enterprises. They're value-based, jointly owned enterprises. They operate according to principles, which I'm going to list on the next page, but they include things about membership, democratic governance, returns based on economic participation, which I'll explain again a little bit more, sustainability and care for community. They can be profit or non-profit. So a lot of people think co-ops are only not-for-profit. They can be for profit, but they don't call it profit, they call it surplus, and it's not their primary purpose. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because I have a table also. So the 7 internationally recognized principles and values of cooperatives include solidarity and self-help, democratic participation. I actually numbered them, but then I realized they're not numbered in the order that the international principles are, so I'm sorry about that. The last 3 are the right order, but I think open participation is actually first, but anyway. Democratic participation, the 1 member, 1 vote, meaning doesn't matter how many shares or how much money you have put into the business or the enterprise, everybody has 1 vote. That's part of what makes it democratic, but they also expect other kinds of democratic participation. Directors are members, so you don't have separate owners, directors than the members. The open participation, meaning technically everybody can join, though some co-ops are allowed to have bonds, right? You can join if you're a part of a certain kind of group, or agree to the mission and the vision and values of the organization. The other part of open participation, though, is also about open books and transparency in terms of how the business operates. Then the limited compensation to capital, what that means is that instead of capital being the all-important thing that, you know, in most regular investment corporations, if you put in a certain amount of capital, then you, quote unquote, deserve a certain amount of influence and decision-making, and you deserve a certain amount of dividend and money back on your investment, especially if the business is successful. In a cooperative, you don't automatically deserve compensation just because you put in capital. The compensation is more about your participation and your membership, and not so much about how much you invest. You can still get, you know, a return back on your investment, but it's not the main purpose of the co-op. It's not the biggest part of being an owner, that kind of thing. And then, as we said, you can actually incorporate a co-op as a not-for-profit. Credit unions are not-for-profit cooperative financial institutions. So their charters in the United States are not-for-profit. They have to be not-for-profit financial institutions. But credit unions in Canada are actually for-profit. They're the same for-profit as a commercial bank. However, they have different bylaws, and they operate under these kinds of principles, and their owners are all the depositors. So whether it's for profit or not, it can still be a co-op. The last three are the most, well, and the democratic participation are the most important things to think about in thinking about cooperative enterprises and ownership. One is the continuous education. You can't really do all the things above that I talked about. Have one member, one vote, have transparent books, collective decision-making if everybody isn't educated, doesn't have the same information, right? So one of the things that early cooperators realized is you have to continuously talk about, teach, learn together in order to run a cooperative business. Concern for community is another principle of cooperatives, meaning that you give back to your community. You're focused, on your community, what's good for your community, sustainability of your community, and also often give monetary donations and other support to your community. And then cooperation among cooperatives. Cooperatives should be helping each other, buying from each other, supporting each other, so that the system can thrive and gain economies of scale from the interactions. So those are the values that a cooperative is supposed to follow in order to be officially recognized and incorporated as a co-op around the world. And the US co-op laws do require some recognition of all those same principles. A little bit more about what joint ownership means, right? Especially for low-income people and people of color. Joint ownership has meant pooling scarce resources, so pooling little, meager, scarce resources and leveraging them into bigger pots of money. So buying in bulk, doing small equity drives where everybody just needs to put in $5, $1, $10, $500, as opposed to having to put in thousands, that kind of thing. At the same time, you're reducing the individual risk, so you're involved in official enterprises, but as a collective, as a group of people, so no one person is at risk. Profit sharing goes back to that whole democratic participation. So any surplus or profit that's made by the business gets to be decided collectively what happens to it, and then shared equally, or at least shared democratically. And then the joint allows low-income people and people who don't have as much experience to join together and create a situation where they can be an owner of an enterprise. They can stem capital flight, the loss of capital from a community, by reining it back in and having the community control it more, and bringing access like co-op housing allows people who might not normally be able to get a mortgage or own an apartment or a house to then have access to that kind of an asset, that kind of thing. And then here's the chart. Investor stock corps are on the, I don't know how you guys are looking at it, my right, the non-red part, and then the cooperative side is the red part. So in co-ops, it's member owners. In stock companies and investor stock companies, it's investor owners. In co-ops, it's one member, one vote. In ISCs, it's one share, one vote. So that in an ISC, if you put in, if you buy 10 shares or 100 shares or 1 million shares, you have 1 million votes. In a co-op, it doesn't matter how many shares you buy, you just have one vote as a member. So it's your membership that gives you voting rights in a co-op, and it's your money, how much money you have invested, that gives you your voting rights in an investor corp. Co-ops, their purpose is to satisfy a need, to solve a problem in a community, to make accessible, affordable, high quality goods and services. Those are the purposes of co-ops. The purposes of investor corps are profit, right? Most people invest in a company because they think it's going to make a profit. They're expecting to make a profit. They want their shares to increase in value, and they want to get a dividend every year. And so that's why we say the profit motive is first. And so again, the difference in the purposes and the values of the organization. Cooperatives, that capital being subordinate to labor and to the usage value, right? That's what I was explaining before about the limited return to capital. In an investor core, right, capital is the thing. That's what you're doing. It's a capitalist system trying to create more capital and give it to the people who already had some to get more, right? And so capital, what we call rents labor, right? The people who have the money then rent the labor to do the work, then they undermine labor to get more money back for themselves and get their capital to reproduce itself. In a co-op, that's not what you're trying to do. Labor is sovereign over labor, and using the co-op, the membership need for the co-op is more important than what happens with the actual money. The democratic governance, as I said, democratic participation is really important, and often some co-ops run as self-governed under consensus, so they're really, really democratic. In investor corps, it's always about the majority, and whoever has the most money makes all the decisions. And then finally, cooperatives really also operate under this sense of solidarity among and between members, solidarity with the community, giving back to community, and making things, having enterprises that make the whole community strong, even if every member of the community is not a member of the co-op. And again, for investor stock corps, it's a return to the investor or the owner. Anybody want to ask a question? Okay, so then the last thing about co-ops, I think it's the last thing, is what kinds, right? There's three major kinds. Consumer cooperative, that helps consumers to pool resources to gain access to needed goods and services at an affordable price. So a food co-op, right? People who want high quality produce or organic food, right, might come together to buy that kind of food in bulk, open up a co-op grocery store to get that kind of access at affordable prices to the kind of food they need or want. Credit union is a similar idea of a consumer co-op, but for financial services, people who don't have access to financial services on a fair footing, or financial services might be too expensive in a bank, a commercial bank or something like that, come together, form a credit union, and the credit union provides financial services and loans at a under much better conditions and much better access. Buying clubs, the same thing. You put your money to buy in bulk so everybody gets it. Housing co-op, I said before, ways to make housing affordable so that the group is buying the property and getting the mortgage, not any one individual, but each individual actually has ownership rights to their unit. Producer co-ops help members process and or market their goods themselves as a collective so that they're more efficient, right? So some producer co-ops, like agricultural co-ops, you could still own your own farm, but then all the individual farmers, like Land O'Lakes, all the individual dairy farmers own Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes turns the milk into cheese and yogurt and butter and processes the milk and plants that are owned, factories that are owned by all the farmers who are members of the agricultural co-op, and then distributes that, right, markets it, helps the farmers buy in bulk for the things they need to run their farms, etc. So that's what we mean by a producer's co-op. Craft co-ops are like that too, quilting or artists, right, who have a co-op together. They still might do their own art by themselves, but then the co-op does all the marketing, finalizing, all the backroom administrative work, that kind of thing. And then finally, worker co-ops are co-ops that are totally owned by the employees. So the members are actually the worker owners rather than consumers or producers. And these are usually governed democratically, or at least governed where all of the employees are members of the board of directors. And so the board of directors or the whole employee owners run the company and make all the rules and decide on the pay and all that kind of thing. Oh, and I forgot, there's actually a fourth. There's a growing new kind of co-ops called stakeholder co-ops. And those are where you have multiple, right? You have worker owners and consumers all owning the co-op together with different levels of rights. Still no questions, right? We're all good still? Okay. And then the final thing about co-ops, especially co-ops relative to investor stock companies and other kinds of companies, is that they actually have better longevity than traditional corporations, especially small businesses. So some studies have found where most small businesses, about 60 to 80% of them fail after the first year, only 10% of co-ops fail after the first year. And after 5 years, about 90% of co-ops are still open, where only 3 to 5% of traditional small businesses are still open. So in addition to all those other benefits in terms of the list of values and principles that co-ops operate on, so doing values-based business, they also actually tend to last longer and to have better, lower failure rates, longer longevity. In part because of all the sharing and the collective decision-making, all the work and education that has to go into making the enterprise work, that helps it to stay longer. Have crises better and often address crises better. And then this was just something the National Cooperative Business Association here in the US put together during the year of cooperation 2012. They got their co-ops to talk about what they thought the 10 best things about being a co-op was. So I'm not going to go over it too carefully. I can put this PowerPoint in the resource, right? There's going to be a resource folder or something at some point, right? I can put this in there and you can look at it more closely. But it talks about most of the same kinds of stuff, right? Share burdens evenly during a crisis, help communities, are democratically owned, right? Provide money and jobs in communities, are more resilient, part of an international movement. Okay, so now you guys definitely have to talk, because this is the part where I've got at least 2 people who signed up, and I'm so sorry, but the paper where I wrote down who was going to do the reflections, I lost it somehow over the last 2 weeks. But I know we're going to start with our host, and then whoever was the other person hopefully will step up.
Okay, so we're starting off with me. Good.
Yep.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I had some reflections on both the introduction and the chapter 1. A few of the things that stood out to me specifically were in the very beginning, in the introduction, one of the first things you talk about is how there are, well, as of 1994, so a little ways back, there were nearly 3 billion worker, or like there were 3 billion cooperative enterprises in the entire world. Or there are 3 billion, not 3 billion total enterprises, but people working within cooperative enterprises. And that really blew my mind, because I'm like, dang, that was probably like half the population at that time. And I think that really broadens the scope of it, right? It's not some like esoteric, you know, oh yeah, those guys in the USSR, you know, there's like popular like socialist countries that people want to talk about that like didn't work, and then having it be like, oh well, there are 3 billion people living under that kind of system right now today. So I thought that was really cool. Let's see what else we got. I mean, of course, just the cooperative model is one that I think is very lucrative, or one that is really prime to be picked apart, especially in a place like America, because so many of the ideals that are kind of attributed to the cooperative model, I feel are also areas where American people specifically would really be able to get attached to it. So, you know, you think about things like democracy in the workplace. I think since Americans tend to hold up democracy to such a high standard, talking to them about how privately owned firms now, how it's more autocratic, more top down, and talking about how that's not a very democratic system, I think that would be a good way to bring people around to that kind of thought process. Let's see what else we got. Sorry, I made a lot of notes, so you'll have to bear with me, please. I also liked how in the introduction you talked about kind of the classical or the more like liberal economist thought of the firm as an asset and not necessarily as a component of the community. So it's seen more as, like you said, a means of making profit, a means of building up one's asset, and not necessarily even something that should qualify for democracy. Like, why should you get a vote in this corporation or in this firm when, I mean, do you own it? Like, you're not the CEO. Like, what right do you have? Even though most people on earth are going to be spending most of their time at work, if, you know, not doing something else, you know? So I thought that was a big thing. And I guess I will wrap up. If there's anything from chapter 1 specifically that really got me, it was just that I think I might have found my calling in life, and that is to build my own commune. Maybe I'll like move to Kansas or something. There's plenty of land out there. You know, get like 10, 12, 20 of my buddies, and we'll just ride out and figure it out. Because when talking about the, let's see, I'm trying to remember what the specific commune was called. I want to say it was like NAEI.
Mm-hmm.
That really stuck out to me as something that
I think it was Nashua. Nashua, was that the one?
Yes.
Was it the Northampton Association of Education and Industry?
I think it was
Yeah.
that one. Yes.
Or the
latter.
Northampton, the Silk Farm. The Silk Farm.
Yes, the Silk Farm.
Yeah, that was funny.
That really stood out to me as something that, I mean, obviously the means and the production would probably be a little bit different. I'm not trying to be a silk farmer, but you know, that kind of model, hosting people of all different walks of life and all different identities, and kind of coalescing that, you know, collective potential to make something better for everybody. I thought it was funny that I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but it's like Sojourner Truth. Yeah, I thought it was very funny how she said that one of the main reasons it had failed is because the individualism of the, you know, different members kind of broke down the communal spirit. And I thought that was very relevant in our current American landscape. So yeah, that was what I had for the most part.
Great, thanks. I have a couple of comments, and then hopefully the other person, is it Damon? Were you the one?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, great. I'll give you a second. I just wanted to, before I forgot, I wanted to say a couple of things. Yeah, I loved when I heard that story about Sojourner Truth. One, I loved it because it enabled me to start claiming that basically you just need to name me a famous Black person and I'll find you some connection they had to a co-op.
Right.
And no one's actually forced me to do a trivia about that, but pretty much have found, even Martin Luther King, I found, was trying to start a credit union once. So, you know, starting back with David Ruggles and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, they were all trying to do co-op stuff and involved in co-ops in some way or another, and it just keeps going from there. So that's the other thing. And then it was so funny to me that they made her the head of housekeeping or something, which, you know, in some ways is like really, really bad. But on the other hand, she had white people working for her, which is really weird, right? Remember, this is what, 1742 or something. That's right. So even though it was still a stereotypical Black women's job, being the supervisor was not. So it's a really interesting, right? All these stories have really interesting sort of contradictions and firsts in some ways. So I did want to point that out. The other thing is, yeah, the 3 billion, you know, I looked that up the other day because I was trying to check myself on the 3 billion. And actually now the International Cooperative Alliance, they don't say 3 billion anymore. I think they say 12% of the world's population and 3 million co-ops around the world. So I don't know if that's because there's fewer people or because they were double counting people, because most of the numbers are probably because of people in credit unions and financial institutions. But a lot of those people are also in other co-ops. So I think they might have
I mean, but
decide. But anyway,
I don't think that takes away from the value of that statistic, even if it was,
right,
you know, through credit unions or
right,
something like
right,
that.
right. And even 12% of the population is actually huge.
Yeah.
It's no slouch. And then there's some countries, right, where it's a much bigger part, right? I think even France and Italy, it's like 20 to 30% of their economy is in co-ops. Even in the US, the agricultural sector is at least 20 or 30% co-ops. We don't think about it, but Land O'Lakes is like a multi-billion-dollar company, but it's technically a co-op. It's not the kind of co-op we would think of, but it's still a functioning, legally identified cooperative. So is Ocean Spray Cranberry. So is, what's that? Florida's Natural Orange Juice. One of the nut companies, Blue Diamond or something. Anyway, there's a bunch of these agricultural co-ops that are huge. And what, a third of the electric companies are rural electric co-ops, because we didn't have rural, there's no rural electricity in the United States if you're not talking about cooperatives, because the capitalists would not electrify the rural United States. And it had to be done through small co-ops that then coalesced into a national association. So anyway, so you're right that it's not a small thing. And yet here in the United States, we act like it's so insignificant and marginal, right? But in the rest of the world, people are really, these are significant activities, significant sectors, significant people who are involved in living life this way. So I do think, I agree. And that's sort of why I had it in there, that to show it's important, right? It's not an insignificant movement.
Yeah, for sure. And it blows my mind really that it isn't a big deal. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of that information, as you said, has kind of been kept out of the history books and kept out of the narrative of not only, you know, economic development as a whole, but of the Black economic development, of just like Black sustainability in America. Like, how were these people able to come up out of a position of slavery, like for real chattel slavery, to at the very least like still economically, socially viable? You know, it can only be a couple ways, because it definitely wasn't becoming capitalist. That was not what happened. Yeah, so appreciate that.
Nice. Yeah, thank you so much. Let's give Jared a hand. Jaru a hand.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Damon.
No, I mean, one of the points that really stood out to me in the piece was, and I may pronounce this wrong, is the Combahee River colony, which is synonymous with like the Gullah Geechee atmosphere or culture, and how a lot of these were propped up even before they were formalized as mutual aid societies or union banks, et cetera, just through the ingenuity of, you know, the Black woman. And so that really stood out to me as kind of a need state. And one of the benefits that we have at Kefra is being able just to kind of lean on that. But it also really raised the point for me that, you know, brothers need to step their job up. So that was one point that I thought really stood out for whatever reason. So one of the questions that I had was, and I don't know if this is later in the chapters, but particularly that point that Jeru pointed out, where a lot of them from Sojourner Truth was, you know, a lot of those that were set up were just, you know, well-intentioned white folks with high dreams, and really the cultural dynamics of where they were at is what really created kind of the short-lived ones. I think even the one from Sojourner Truth, the NAE, it said something like 4 years or 5 years of existence, and it had prominent people. I really reading there even too that Frederick Douglass would frequent it, or somebody with the last name Douglas would frequent.
Yeah, it was Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass would frequent it, and you really don't hear that in history from his experience on that. And so that kind of raised the question. Well, one question for me, particularly in today's age, where we're seeing a lot, in my opinion, a lot of the same things, you know, well-intentioned white folks with, you know, either community impact funds or SBA loans, et cetera, are there like real examples, and particularly maybe outside of religion, because I do remember the AME being one of kind of the long-standing institutions that came out of a cooperative. Are there examples of that where it was just, you know, black bucks, black bootstrapping to build a co-op, and have they been able to sustain based on that? And I don't know if that's later in the book as well, but that was one thing that probably stood out to me the most in the book, was that they start with high intentions, and when society doesn't necessarily cooperate, they fall apart. I thought it was pretty interesting. They would start a silk farm, is I believe it was in Maryland or Hampton or something like that. Northeast, is that even conducive of silk farming in that particular area, which is really speaks to me to the naivete in their approach with it. And so how do we avoid those same pitfalls as we move forward with the idea of cooperatives? Just from your opinion, that was my first question.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. Just quickly about Frederick Douglass at the Northampton Institute. I'm reading the newest biography about him, which is about 600 pages long. And I was so upset because they never once mentioned that he used to stop there on his trips. They talked about all the traveling he did every year, but they never once talked about that he went and lived in a co-op, a collective community, and talked about how important that was. So the same thing happened when I read Ella Jo Baker's book. At least there was a little bit about her activity in the Young Negroes Cooperative League, which comes up in a couple of chapters, about 3 more chapters, but very little, and no discussion about how, that was her formative years. She was just out of college when she did the Young Negroes Cooperative League, and all that stuff she learned about democratic grassroots organizing, she then used in the WPA, the NAACP, SNCC, whatever. So they did at least talk about her in the Young Negroes Cooperative League, but they never made those connections to her growth as a grassroots leader, right? So it's really hard, even when you get Black folks doing these histories, that they just never think of the economics part as being so significant, or the cooperative economics piece, which is another reason why I wrote the book, because it was so frustrating to never get those stories, or to have the stories so so marginalized in the rest of the stories. I used to call what I learned recently is the Combahee River Colon Society. I used to call it Combahee too, but then I went to a session at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, all about Harriet Tubman and the Combahee River, and found out it's actually called the Combahee River.
I don't feel so bad.
Yeah. And so in the graphic novel version of Collective Courage that I'm working on right now, we actually wrote a bigger section about the Combahee River, because that Combahee River society that the Black women started farming collectively once the area was liberated and the men left. It was liberated by Harriet Tubman. I think I mentioned that briefly, but there's actually a whole story. Apparently, historians were trying to write her out of that history. They were trying to de-emphasize the fact that she had been a scout and had gotten her information by scouting all in and out of there, and quizzing all the Black folks about like the mines that were in the river and when the white folks were there, and all kinds of stuff, so that they could have that successful raid. It just, as I said, apparently the raid was, they liberated 750 African people in that 5-hour raid, and only the Confederacy had deaths.
Wow.
And mostly because of Harriet Tubman's intelligence. And then because Harriet Tubman was on that raid, the Black folks trusted the white Union Army, so that they left the plantations and became freed that way. And then that's why most of the men joined the army and the women went back and took over the land, because luckily the Union Army wouldn't allow the white folks back on that land. And so the women then did the only thing they know how to do, which is collectively run farms and make crafts and keep the families going and the communities going. So it's really even more fascinating than what I had in the book. So I tried to put more of it into the graphic novel that's going to come out. So I'm glad you like that. And then for any of you who are real history buffs, you would know that the Black feminist movement also used that society. The Black women in Boston in the 70s who came up with intersectionality and Black feminist theory called themselves the Combahee River Collective after the Combahee River raid. I'm not sure they even knew about the co-op collective work the women were doing. They were trying to honor Harriet Tubman and her raid there. But anyway, so there's all kinds of interconnections, as I keep saying, with all this stuff. And women's roles, yeah, I'm sorry, guys, but I was actually even amazed, because normally in history you don't hear so much about women, and in the co-op movement, most ethnic groups are complaining that the women don't have much role in co-ops or only do the scud work and have no leadership. But I found in every era, the Black women were just kicking butt and starting co-ops and running co-ops and all that kind of stuff. So you'll see it keeps figuring in. And then I even have a chapter about it because I realized I needed to focus in on that. Again, the men weren't slouches, but the women just were really all over this stuff. And, you know, there was a study done in the 90s at Emory University that did, they tested endorphins when people cooperated together, and they found out that women's endorphins actually got even higher. Everybody's endorphins rose when they cooperated, but women's endorphins rose even more when they cooperated. So there's actually a physiological, chemical thing about cooperation.
That's cheating. That's cheating.
It doesn't mean you guys can't do it or can't feel it. So sorry, I'm digressing, but I can't help putting these things out there. The other thing, okay, and then two more things quickly, or maybe it's not going to be quick, but these are also themes that will keep coming back. So you also talked about the short-livedness. And I think I tried to say in the intro, but I definitely have been saying in most of my talks, I tried not to use the word failure.
Right.
Because even the short-lived, and maybe we did talk about this last time, even the short-lived efforts succeeded at some things, right? So, and, you know, we all want them to have lasted longer and do more, right? Because we're all excited about what they did do and whatever. But when I did study them, and sometimes I didn't even know how or why they failed. Sometimes I did, right? So I didn't have even information about it. But what I did have was, it's very clear that the process, right? And we did talk about this, the process of sort of becoming more human by being involved in co-ops and collective activity, right? There's not a failure on that side, right? Because you always come out of these experiences a better human being, a better person with more knowledge, with more experience. So even if the actual business enterprise didn't last a long time, the effects of the process and the humanization does last. And so that's why I try not to say that any of them are failures. They're experiments, they're trials, they're precursors to something else, right? A lot of people went on to do other things after they were in one of these co-ops, but also sometimes the co-ops ended, or the collective activity ended, because it did what it was supposed to do. Like even some of those Black communal societies, especially the ones that were bought by white people and they threw Black people on there, it was technically just supposed to get Black people to learn how to live not as enslaved peoples, right? How to make it on their own, how to be independent or whatever. And so in that sense, you know, after a couple of years, the group that's there, they know how to do that. So if they decide to move on, or, you know, and then sometimes the economics just doesn't work, and they either didn't pay enough attention to the business model or the economics or whatever, and then you learn better for the next time. but they also have gained skills that they didn't have before. So that's the other piece. And so I try to also talk about that throughout the book. Like, so what did get gained, even if this didn't happen and that didn't happen, what did, you know, what was gained? How do we move forward? And you know, what are the lessons learned? Because it seems like every example that I found, there were lessons learned. And then the last thing about, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I don't know if it's an echo, but and that was kind of one of the main threads that stood out to me, because I saw the one, the AME Church by the African American Mutual Aid Society, and that and the Combi one were more, for lack of a better word, militant in the fact that leadership was Black and leadership development was Black and other people, male or female, and those tended to weather the storm and build institutions, because a lot of that was more about intentionality. And that's where I kind of drew the connections with today, where we're kind of getting a lot of these well-intentioned people who because of what's going on with, you know, social upheaval and unrest and just flat out wrongness, are coming with a lot of these same intentions, but you know, how much of that is connected to internal leadership development, you know, economic bootstrap, things of that nature. That's what kind of drew those parallels to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make, and I'm going to start making that more now that you've pointed it out. So thanks, you gave me another thing to focus on more. Because I think I probably did sort of say it, but you're right that we should focus more on that, right? The things that were more paternalistic, that were more people doing it for other people, that were more service-oriented, right, also don't last as long as the ones that are really, right, deliberately done by, and where Black leadership is there and Black leadership is developed and sustained, and where Black people are doing it for themselves. Those are the things that last longer, right, that are more sustainable, that are stronger. I think that's absolutely right. And I think you'll see that as the book progresses, you'll see more of that also. But I wanted to keep those examples in at the beginning because they were still part of the reality. They were part of what some of these collective experiences were. But you're right, it is an important lesson to learn too about that sort of paternalistic kind of activity. It just isn't as sustainable, isn't as strong. And we should pay attention to that nowadays, right? You want allies, right? But you don't want people thinking they have to do for us or do it, you know, or make it for us or whatever. We just want them to be allies and listen to us telling them what we need, right? And then the final thing about failures, a lot of the time I noticed that the failures were sort of harped on as a reason not to try to do it again through history, which was another reason why I was trying to not call them failures, because I saw in the history, in the stories we tell ourselves, that often we were telling our children and other people about the failure as a failure, right? And so I was trying to help us get away from that language of failure. And then the final thing about failures is that a lot of the times the co-ops didn't work because of white terrorism, right? White sabotage and white terrorism. And so a lot of the times we still told the story as if we did something wrong, but when you look at the details, it was actually, we weren't doing anything wrong. We were sabotaged against. And so I also tried to point that out along the way, all the different times and ways that it was white folks and the folks with money that wouldn't let it happen, wouldn't let us do it, because it was a threat, right? It was a threat to their own businesses. It was a threat to their hegemony, to their power, and they didn't want us to succeed. So often, you know, they're the ones who messed it up or wouldn't allow it to succeed, and then let us feel like it was something we did wrong.
And I'm sorry to interject, but there was a great piece, I think we've been sharing it, that's Segregated by Design, that kind of backs up a lot of that too. I'll put a link in the chat, but yeah, I was kind of watching that at the same time as reading this, and I was like, wow.
Yeah. So those are some of the lessons learned. And then you were asking about institutions, and I think it comes up later. But also one of the things I have been saying when I give presentations about the book is one of the things I learned was how important Black organizations were to Black co-op development. that if I, and you'll see when you finish reading the book, but it turns out there's about 3 periods in US history that had the most number of Black co-ops, or at least that I could find. And those 3 periods were the 1880s, 1930s and 40s, and the 1960s and 70s. So then I was like, okay, so what's similar? What's the same in those 3 periods? Well, one of the major things that's the same across all those 3 periods was strong Black organizations that also helped to promote co-op, at least co-op economics, if not co-op development. So in the 1880s, you have actually the progressive labor unions, integrated labor unions were promoting co-op development and integrating with Blacks. You had Black labor unions, the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union was doing co-op development, as well as it was a political party and a labor union. And so you have a lot of political activity with co-op development activity. You have integration of issues all together, and like the Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union was 1 million strong, had 1 million Black people in the 1880s. And if you know anything about the 1880s, they're very similar to now. It's the end of the Reconstruction period. It was the beginning of Jim Crow. It was the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan. It's a very repressive political, it's economically a bad period. People are starving. People aren't sure if they can stay on farms or where they're going to get jobs. And to have 1 million people, mostly in the South, having to be underground because they were preyed upon all the time because they were too progressive, all talking about unionization of labor and labor owning their own means of production and having credit exchanges and teaching about cooperatives and cooperative land ownership. That's a huge, huge thing. And that's right. So that's what's happening in the 1880s, 1930s, right, is the Great Depression. And so you have economic need, and you even actually have the federal government supporting co-op development, even for Blacks, but you also have strong Black organizations, the Young Negroes Cooperative League. Du Bois is trying to get the NAACP to support co-ops. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which starts in the middle of the 1930s as, our first official independent Black trade union, is doing co-op development and co-op education. And so again, the importance of strong Black organizations. By the 60s, the economy is not so bad, but you have this, again, focus on Black organizations. All the civil rights organizations are very quietly supporting the development of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is our only Black major co-op development association, still exists today. But if you look at the history, all the major 5 civil rights organizations went to a meeting that was funded by Ford Foundation, where they agreed that there needed to be a Southern Regional Co-op Development Association supporting Black co-op development. And so, you don't hear them. That's not what Martin Luther King said at the March on Washington in '63 or whatever, but that's what they were all doing behind the scenes. The Black Panther Party was practicing cooperative economics. That's how they were interpreting the need for safety, public safety against state violence, was by having our own controlled community cooperative activity, right? Other Black organizations are doing co-ops, especially in the South. And so again, you can't underestimate the importance of Black organizations institutionalizing and teaching about cooperatives, even when they had to do it underground, quietly, subversively, but they were doing it. So that's the other really interesting thing, and you'll see it as we get into the next chapters. Anybody else want any brief reflections, comments, and then I'll talk about my favorite sections of chapter 1.
Well, this is Pambana, and I just want to ask you a question because, in reading it, and when you said you set out, people were saying, no, Black folks don't do cooperatives. And then you unearthed a lot of this information where we have, and even in my young adult, I participated in a cooperative. So I want to know, what do you attribute that to, that Black folks were saying that we don't do cooperatives, but we did? Was it more because it was, like you said, a under the radar kind of thing, or lost memory? What do you attribute that to? Or did we not call them cooperatives? Did we call them something else? So does that term not resonate with us?
It's all of those things. I found out, right, that the word co-op to them meant a hippie food co-op or a hippie commune. That's the first thing. And if it didn't mean that, it meant communism and socialism, right? So the first was the language, right? So when I started telling the stories and describing what people did, I got more people saying, oh yeah, now I remember, now I see, oh, my grandparents did something like that, right? So part of it was the language and the terminology. Part of it was because of this, the fear of being called a communist or a socialist if you talked about, right? So a lot of the co-ops didn't even name themselves a co-op, right? They used a different name so that it wasn't obvious that they were a co-op, even though they were practicing collectivism and co-op principles. So they used a different name to protect themselves so they wouldn't be obvious, right? So that was another problem. So then if you don't have co-op in the name, no one's used to calling these kinds of things a co-op, right? And then there's definitely, because of the sabotage, both the political as well as the economic sabotage, there was often, right, you just did it under the radar. You didn't really tell, if you told your kids you were going to a meeting, but maybe they thought it was a community meeting, not a co-op meeting, you know what I'm saying? So there, a lot of stuff got lost because of that. But the thing that was heartening to me was once I stopped worrying about the terminology and started just telling the stories and describing what people did, then I stopped getting people. In fact, I got the opposite. I started getting people coming up to me afterwards, emailing me and telling me about stuff they knew about from their families, sending me pictures and stuff of things that their families were involved in and things like that. So it really kind of turned around once I stopped worrying about the terminology so much. And then once, when I first started, I wasn't really that clear about economic cooperation in general. I was trying to focus on co-ops, and then I didn't know about the social solidarity economy movement, but I started learning about that. And now, I talk more about solidarity economies and economic cooperation, not just co-ops. And that also, once you start talking about, right, people even doing barter and isusus and things like that, which aren't really formally co-ops, but they're definitely solidarity economics and economic cooperation, which is also what Du Bois used, when I didn't realize why he was using it that way until I started learning more about it. That also resonates more to people when you talk about these broader ways that people relate to each other economically, as opposed to trying to talk about a specific kind of business or something. So I don't know if that was your question, but.
And that was a point too, that was kind of my second question, is like, and I think you've answered it, like those models, because I'm finding it hard in my mind to like really equate co-ops as a tool to defeat corrupt capitalism when they ultimately operate on a capitalistic system in most cases. And that's, that's the rub. I mean, but now you have like the proliferation of digital currencies and things like that. And like you said, also with the solidarity economy, really interested in how that's shaping out. Not that everybody could go back to, bartering, rice for corn or whatever, but, what are those contracts beyond, these paper money that's mostly held up in, banks and federal banking agencies and things of that nature.
Right. One of the things that really caught me when I started studying solidarity economics is that some of it is just stuff we do every day, again, as human beings, right? It's trying to capture that, the invisible work that we do, the invisible value, the way that we operate, right? To try, to stay human in a dehumanizing world, right? So some of it is just, so it's not trying to get us to do something new, but to recognize that what we do is still economics, even if it's not capitalist, right? And that it's still helpful and valid. And so that's also some of what even I've been learning more for myself too, is to understand, to see, right, to value those undervalued, hidden invisible labor and exchanges that really make, keep us all going, keep the fabric connected, and right, keep us alive some of the times, right? And so I also try to remind people that kind of some of the stuff we do every day, it's not that different. It's just if we want to do more of it and formalize more of it, then we need to, learn and understand how to operate more formally the ways that we kind of do naturally, And then my hope is, one of you, I think it was Jeru, talked about, that we spend so much time at work, and at work we're being indoctrinated the other way, right? We're being dehumanized, we're being indoctrinated to accept hierarchy, exploitation, whatever. But if we could change the nature of work, if we could take control over our workplaces with worker co-ops and other, multi-stakeholder co-ops, we could also spend the majority of our life in real democratic, humane activities and organizations, right? And then imagine what the rest of our lives and our societies would be like if we were all spending most of our time doing, treating each other well and creating the things that we need and sharing them and making sure everybody had it. And right. I mean, it sounds utopian, but actually, that was what I was trying to show, that when you put your mind to it, you can create those kinds of enterprises and we could live that kind of a life. But we do have to be very deliberate about it. We have to train ourselves to do it, and we've got to be forceful about not allowing the rest of the world to stop us, or at least the rest of the United States. A lot of the world would be supportive of us and is supportive of us doing that. So that's thanks. Oh, and Curtis is here taking a lot of notes for you guys. If you want to look in the chat, he's been noting stuff. Oh, I like that. Failure is a verb, not a noun. Thanks. I'm going to put my PowerPoint up one more time I'm going to go fast through some of my favorite examples, and then I think there'll still be more time for questions and dialogue. Did I have somebody else who wanted to say something? Did I hear you? Paulette, were you trying to say something, Miss Paulette? No? Okay. So also remember there's a part 1 to the book, and in there I just tried to kind of introduce the early co-op situation for African Americans and talk about the lessons learned. I think I'm going to skip this because it's all listed in bullets in the 3 pages of part 1 description. And we've been talking about some of these things too, right? That we've used cooperation for survival, to gain freedom, and to advance, right? We pooled resources. There's a role for women, the trust and solidarity, right? That gets developed from other connections is really important to creating cooperative solidarity. The education and training are important, and that sabotage really interfered. And then community and organization matter. So how important organizations are, we also got to that already, and how important it was for co-op development and education that we have Black organizations promoting co-ops. And then community support, I didn't talk as much about. It'll come up some more in other places, but also against the sabotage. A lot of co-ops that did survived because communities supported them and protected them, either physically putting themselves in the way of the white supremacists with guns and fireballs or whatever, torches, and sometimes supporting in terms of actually using the co-op, passing supportive policies to help the co-op stay in, donating to the co-op, that kind of thing. So look for examples of community support, because that's another thing about the longevity. Some of the co-ops were much more last long because they really do engage the whole community much more, and the community sees it as part of them. The other thing that came out for me as I was studying, because again, when I first learned about co-ops, I learned about them from a Eurocentric mode, right? And in the Eurocentric tradition, though, again, they've been changing that in the last few years, but they used to say that the first co-op was the Rochdale Pioneers Co-op in England in 1844. But now I was looking online and noticed that they've taken that language out and said it was an early co-op, but not the first one. And they started to recognize some of the even earlier stuff that happened in the US. They still don't talk that much about early African civilizations and cooperation there, but they at least start talking about some of the earlier cooperatives besides the Rochdales. But really, if you start to look at cooperation and notions of the commons and commonwealth and collective ownership, it's really every population in the world and every era of history on every continent, right? We have these economic cooperation, notions of the common good, the commons, et cetera, mutual aid, that kind of thing. And then, you know, early First Nations, early African civilizations, the Kwanzaa, right? There's 2 Kwanzaa principles that use Swahili words for collective work and responsibility and cooperative economics. In fact, our December 28th meeting happens during Kwanzaa. And so we're going to talk about Kwanzaa and the connection to cooperatives when we meet then. But it's also important, again, so that we see that, you know, that cooperation is not just a Eurocentric thing, even though it's often considered that. And then, right, chapter 1, I talked mostly about intentional communities, some communes, and mutual aid. I think I talked about all this already. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, self-help and grassroots economic organizing, it's not just even the mutual aid stuff. It was even earlier than that, collective resistance, right, using solidarity for escape. W.E.B. Du Bois actually talked about the Underground Railroad, and I think I saw a quote from Frederick Douglass also, where they both talked about the Underground Railroad is actually, I mean, we would call it now a sort of solidarity economic project, right? But definitely as economic cooperation, because if you think about it, they had to move people, right, from enslavement up to freedom, technically freedom, right? It wasn't always really freedom, right? They had to feed people along the way. They had to share means of transportation. They had to share information, right? So it definitely was a collective solidarity effort to even run and do the Underground Railroad. You needed people who had homes that had hidden basements, right, to hide people. You needed people who had wagons that could, you know, that had a false bottom that could hide people. So you know, you had to pool resources and connect people with resources, and right. So there's a lot of ways you can think about economic organizing and cooperative economics, even from those kinds of what we would have thought of more as social or even political activities, right? And then the mutual aid societies actually did do healthcare and burial societies and land and equipment sharing and that kind of stuff. I also wanted to share, actually, you guys, I hope you enjoy all the quotes in the book. I loved finding all those quotes from different Black scholars and sometimes not Black scholars. And so hopefully you're enjoying the quotes, right? There's some at the beginning of every chapter. There's some embedded in the chapters. But I did want to highlight this one from De Philippis because even though he's a white scholar, he's a community development scholar. And it was really interesting that he says the whole history of community control in the US has its roots in the community ownership movements of Blacks from these early Black communal organized communities in the 19th century, some of which I gave you a couple of examples. So here's a white guy looking at trying to understand community control and the community economic development movement from the 60s on up. And he's saying we actually have to understand that movement by first looking at those early Black organized communities and communes. So I just wanted to remind us of that, right? It's not just a Black history, right? The stuff that we did as African Americans also does impact the larger community and these larger movements. And then I think we already talked about the Combahee River Society. Yeah, I think I said all that already. And just again, the strength of the women, they refused to work for whites anymore once they were liberated. And so they figured out ways to work together to maintain their independence and to run those farms. It used to be, right, those farms had been these large plantations, and they figured out how to run them collectively with the women that were left. The mutual aid societies are, I just realized I don't have a real definition of them, but anyway, they're informal and formal organizations of people to do joint purchasing, marketing, etc. And so basically what you do is you come together with a need. The first mutual aid societies were burial societies. If you know anything about African culture, it was very important for African people to be buried in the right way, right? You're supposed to face west in most of the societies. You're supposed to be buried with things that mattered to you. When we were enslaved and even once freed, it was very difficult, right, to do the correct burials, right? And well, the masters didn't even care, so they just did whatever. So actually, it's really interesting culturally and economically interesting that the first mutual aid societies, at least for African Americans, were these burial societies so that we could actually bury our dead properly. And so we pooled money, people put in dues, and then if someone in your family died, you were able to take out what you needed from the pooled money in the mutual aid society to pay for that. And then after burial, we went to widow and orphan services, sickness and health benefits, revolving loan funds for other kinds of purchases, and joint marketing and purchasing. Often they started through Black religious organizations and Black-owned schools. Again, many were headed by women. In fact, in some places, women-run mutual aid society, Black women-run mutual aid societies were like twice as many as male or co-ed mutual aid societies. These, again, this notion that you could pool, you know, 1 cent, 10 cents here and there and make enough money to handle the needs. Sometimes they did fundraisers, hundreds and thousands of them, especially in the North, but even in the South. And interconnectedness, people might be in 2 or 3 or 4 mutual aid societies at the same time. And then I think, Damien, right, you also had already mentioned, right, the Free African Society and Mutual Aid Society, but it's known the best because those members of that society are the ones who established the AME Church, right, the first official independent church. So again, these connections, right, religious groups and churches often started mutual aid societies, but also mutual aid societies started these independent Black churches. And so that's another interesting. The very first Black mutual aid society on record was a couple years earlier in Rhode Island. But then rapidly they just proliferated all through the Northeast and then even down into the Southeast. Enslaved people as well as free people were in them. And once the Civil War was on, there were obviously more and more freed mutual aids. And then Black women's role, I think we talked about that enough. I did want to mention Callie House and the Ex-Slave Pension Society because it's very relevant now to our reparations movement. This was actually, I believe, the very first reparations demand. In 1896, Callie House and others formed the Ex-Slave Pension Society in order to argue with the federal government that ex-slaves deserved pensions and past wages for their work when they were enslaved. And they spent years petitioning the federal government and really got nowhere. But because they were also a mutual aid society, they were able to stay in business until like 1931, even though they never got their demands for reparations or back pay met. But again, a Black woman was one of the founders of it. The mutual aid aspect kept it solvent. And also this was another example of sabotage, just like Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. So she actually, her sabotage predates Marcus Garvey's mail fraud, but they persecuted her because the mutual aid, because it was a regional national organization, they asked for dues money in the mail. And so the feds accused her of mail fraud and tried to put her in jail and tried to dismantle the organization. So some of the political and the reparations demands had to be dropped, but they were able to continue to being a mutual aid association. And then the other really exciting example for me was the Order of St. Luke. which was basically a fraternal organization, or well, actually a women's mutual aid association, but it was dying by 1899. Had started in Maryland, had moved to Richmond, but then Maggie Lena Walker took it over, became the Grand Secretary, and put in a whole series of projects, including that they started accepting men, they expanded to other states, and she established what she called the Penny a Day Bank, which then became, I think, Richmond Trust and Consolidated Bank. She had a department store, and she had the organization build affordable housing. So by 1924, they had 50,000 members, 1,500 local chapters. She had a staff of 50 women, pretty much women working in the Richmond headquarters, and the organization had assets of over $400,000. So no small feat, no small activity, right? The bank, I think, lasted over 50 years. And Maggie Lena Walker was also, I guess we didn't have the word feminist in those days, but she believed in women's leadership, right? And she believed in cooperation, right? So the second quote here is about how we need to band ourselves together, organize, put our hands and our brains together, and make work and business for ourselves, right? We need to run our own things, control our own destiny. And that women's roles were as essential as men's roles. Black women's roles were as essential to men's roles. And I think I'm done. I think we talked about most of these accomplishments. Yeah. So what do we got? We got a few minutes left for more questions, comments.
Well, I guess I'll jump in here just because I'm just wondering, and maybe further on in your book, you have something about it, but given like in most urban communities, there's high unemployment, there's a lot of homelessness, and you talked about how coming out of slavery, and then I think you did Depression, that Black communities use cooperatives to address that. So I'm just wondering how, given high unemployment and homelessness, how do you, I guess, structure cooperatives so that people who don't have necessarily money or those kind of things to put in can participate? And are there any examples of how they did that?
Right. Great question. So there's a couple things that happened. The first thing is I try to talk about joint resources rather than joint money, because you didn't always have to put in money, or at least not at the beginning, right? Sometimes it was what we call now, I guess, sweat equity, right? Putting in the work, doing the work of of building something or physically doing some work instead of putting in your money. Also the dues, even when it was official co-ops, the share that you had to put in, your equity share, was often small or could be paid in installments. So like the Mercantile Association in 1901, I think that's in chapter 2. They had a $5 membership fee, but you could pay it, in 10 cents for however long it took you to pay $5, right? So you could pay in installments and still be a member, right? So you didn't always have to have the upfront money. You could also start doing some of the work, whether it was, if it was a buying club and you were operating out of somebody's barn, right? Helping to clear out the barn and go buy the goods with everybody's pooled money. You could get a share by doing some sweat equity. So there were ways that you could participate without having actual money to put in, or putting in very little money. Right now, most worker co-ops, even though there's a fee for a membership, like Cooperative Home Care Associates, which we'll talk about much later, but it's a home care co-op in New York City. The fee is actually $1,000, but you pay it, it's taken out of your pay once you start to work there. So you're paying, they take out, $50 a paycheck or something until your $1,000 is paid. And then you actually get an annual dividend on that money each year that the co-op is profitable. So there are ways that people don't have to have the upfront money, but have to have the commitment and participate, that they can do it. Also, yes,
Sorry, I had mixed with that co-op in New York. I didn't catch the name.
Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's later, I think it's in the chapter on women, maybe chapter 7 or something. But also, if you look it up in the index, you can find where I mention it. Actually, there's a lot more to say about that co-op, but we'll wait till we get to that chapter, because they're also doing wealth building and stuff with their members. But the notion of paying, right, if it's a worker co-op, you can pay out of your salary. You don't have to necessarily come up with the money before you get the job, right? And part of the purpose of being a worker co-op is to pay you a decent salary, right, to give you benefits, full-time work, that kind of thing. So that's, most of the worker co-ops have all those kinds of goals in mind for what they're trying to do as a worker co-op. The other thing for like something like housing, even the Black Panthers did this. They did co-housing, right? Everybody couldn't afford a place to live, so they threw everybody into a 3-bedroom apartment. It's not ideal, but it gave them all a place to live and not to have to worry about where to live while they're doing the political and economic work of the party, right? So that's the other thing that co-ops help to do, or at least economic cooperation, right? Help to give another way, especially when there are no resources. Figure out, right, either it's one person who already has the apartment and then everybody chips in, or everybody chips in to get one apartment. It's a little, some of that is a little bit harder nowadays, just because, right, you need first and last month's rent and you need a credit check and whatever. But again, that's why some of these collectives work, because if you've got even one person who has good credit, right, it can be put under their name, right? And then everybody shares. Or you could buy a house together. I've heard a lot of millennials have started doing that. They can't afford a house, but 3 of them buy a house together and share it. But then if you could formally incorporate as a co-op, you also run it, you reduce the issues about who's going to get a mortgage, who can get a fair mortgage, and who needs a good credit rating. You just need a few people who are the initial incorporators of the housing co-op to be able to put that together, and then the mortgage is given to the company, not to individuals. And so your members might have low credit scores, but as long as they pay their share to the co-op, they can afford to live in that co-op. So that's where the structuring of the co-op helps to make things affordable. But then, those are they're not immediate needs, right? It's not like getting people off the street immediately. You got to put in place the co-op structure, then you've got to find a place to buy, and so it's not fast, but it is an ultimate solution, especially if you can get legislation passed to support municipalities, support creation of co-ops, right? I work with a group in DC, Organizing Neighborhood Equity, and one of the things we have done in DC is DC actually has a law where the tenants have first right of refusal if the landlord is going to sell. And we help the tenants to organize themselves into a co-op. And so if the landlord is going to sell and the tenants have first right of refusal, the tenants buy it as a co-op. And then there was for a while, it's not so much anymore, but for a while, DC actually had a fund to help the tenants to convert to a co-op if that's what they voted to do. And so again, that's where the kind of combination of knowing what structures are available, trying to make sure that policies align with them, or that there's enough kind of policy that you can start to do it even without the best policies in place, and then help people to move toward that. Obviously you still might need some short-term solutions for the people who are homeless at the moment, but at least you could start to build long-term solutions, either with people who are already tenants, or people who could move into co-op housing once you create it. There's also a group in New York City that does rehab. They take abandoned buildings, they get the city or the landlords to donate it or whatever, and then they get people to help rebuild the apartments, and then you get to keep the apartment that you helped to rebuild and they're also creating it as a co-op at the same time that they're teaching you how to rebuild your unit. And so you're rebuilding your unit, they're putting together the money or getting it donated, they're training you how to run a co-op, and then when it's all done, you're in there as a co-op, you know how to run the co-op, you've helped to build your unit, and they've transformed abandoned property into a housing co-op.